A car so fast it forced NASCAR's biggest stars to walk off the job. An engine built by a man NASCAR officials searched for cheating parts they could never find. And a speedway so brutal it shredded tires at 200 miles an hour. This is the real story of the 1969 Ford Torino Talladega, the outlaw mechanic who helped shape it, and the boycott that almost broke stock car racing before it ever got the chance to prove what it could do. By the late 1960s, NASCAR had become a battlefield disguised as a sport. Detroit's "win on Sunday, sell on Monday" philosophy meant that every manufacturer treated the superspeedway like a weapons lab. Chrysler had thrown down the gauntlet with a car that looked like nothing else on an oval track, a Dodge Charger with a smoothed-out nose and a fastback roofline built purely to cut through air resistance at speeds nobody had seriously raced at before. Ford's answer had to be just as extreme, and it had to come fast because losing the aerodynamic war meant losing the manufacturer's championship, and losing the manufacturer's championship meant losing sales. Ford's engineers turned to the Torino, a solid but conventional-looking midsize car, and set out to reshape it into something that could survive high-speed banking without getting thrown around by the air. The nose was stretched and dropped lower to the ground. The grille was pulled flush against the body instead of sitting recessed. The front fenders were extended several inches beyond the standard production car. Even the rocker panels were altered, tucked inward to shave the car's stance closer to the track. None of these changes were about looks. Every inch was calculated to reduce drag and keep the car planted at speeds well above 190 miles an hour. Ford named the finished car after the very track it was built to conquer, the brand-new Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama, a track so long and so steeply banked that it promised speeds no stock car had ever touched in competition. A slippery body was only half the equation, though. Without the right engine underneath it, even the most aerodynamic shape in the world was just an expensive shell. Ford had two engines in its arsenal for 1969. The first was the 428 Cobra Jet, a strong, torque-heavy street engine that made the production Talladega comfortable to drive but was never designed to survive hour after hour of sustained high RPM punishment on a superspeedway. The second, and the one that mattered for racing, was the Boss 429, a semi-hemispherical big block built with 4-bolt main bearings and aluminum cylinder heads, rated officially at 375 horsepower but capable of far more once race teams got their hands on it. Because Ford didn't yet have enough Boss 429 powered cars in production to satisfy NASCAR's homologation rules for that engine, the company took an unusual route. It homologated the Torino Talladega's aerodynamic bodywork on its own, separate from the engine, while the Boss 429 was homologated through a run of specially built Mustangs. It was a technical maneuver, not a secret plot, but it captured exactly how far manufacturers were willing to bend the rulebook to get a competitive edge onto the track as fast as possible. This is where Henry "Smokey" Yunick enters the story, though not quite the way legend likes to remember it. Yunick wasn't the architect who drew up the Talladega's bodywork, and he didn't build the car from scratch in a barn somewhere. What he did have, by 1969, was one of the most respected and most feared reputations in all of American racing, built over more than 2 decades of turning ordinary Detroit iron into machines that dominated their era. Born in Pennsylvania in 1923, Yunick grew up fixing farm equipment before the Second World War pulled him into the cockpit of a B-17 bomber, where he flew dozens of combat missions over Europe. That wartime experience, nursing damaged aircraft back to base under pressure, shaped the way he approached machines for the rest of his life. Fast, resourceful, and never entirely by the book. After the war, Yunick settled in Daytona Beach, right as the loose, informal beach races that would eventually become NASCAR were taking shape. By the mid-1950s he was one of the most sought-after engine builders in the sport, first turning Chevrolet's new small-block V8 into a genuine race winner, then doing the same for Pontiac at the end of the decade. Drivers under his direction, including Fireball Roberts, racked up wins that made rival teams tear engines apart looking for whatever trick Yunick was hiding. Most of the time there wasn't one single trick. There was just an obsessive attention to detail that nobody else in the garage was willing to match, wrapped in just enough showmanship and rumor to keep competitors guessing anyway. His relationship with General Motors, though, was never entirely smooth. Yunick had been openly critical of the early Corvette's engineering, and that kind of blunt honesty didn't sit well with GM executives who cared deeply about the brand's image. Tension simmered for years before boiling over in 1968, when Yunick entered a Chevrolet at the Daytona 500 that inspectors discovered had been built noticeably smaller than regulation size, a stunt that embarrassed Chevrolet publicly and effectively ended his working relationship with the manufacturer. Around the same time, Ford brought in Seaman "Bunky" Knudsen, a former GM executive, as company president, and Knudsen understood exactly what Yunick could bring to a race program. The move of a mechanic with Yunick's reputation from Chevrolet's camp to Ford's was treated as a genuine shakeup in the garage area, the kind of transfer that made rival crews nervous before a single race had even been run. At Ford, Yunick worked on multiple fronts at once. He experimented with the exotic 427 SOHC engine, he pushed Ford's ambitions in IndyCar racing with a turbocharged stock block effort, and on the NASCAR side he fielded his own Torino Talladega, running it under his own team banner with drivers including open-wheel veteran Joe Leonard and rising star Swede Savage. His famous shop, the best damn garage in town, became a place where inspectors from NASCAR knew to look twice, not necessarily because they always found something, but because Yunick's reputation alone was enough to put them on edge. Whether every rumor about hidden fuel tanks or altered engines was true almost didn't matter. The mystery around Smokey Yunick was as much a competitive weapon as anything bolted onto one of his cars, and it kept rival teams chasing shadows instead of focusing on their own setups. While Ford, Yunick, and the rest of the garage were preparing for the season, the sport itself was about to run headlong into a crisis that had nothing to do with engines or bodywork. The brand-new Talladega Superspeedway had been built bigger, longer, and more steeply banked than Daytona, specifically to push speeds even higher. In testing before the track's first race, cars were approaching and even exceeding 200 miles an hour, speeds that put enormous strain on tire technology that simply wasn't ready for that kind of punishment. Tires were failing in testing, shredding apart under the combination of extreme speed and the track's brutal banking. One tire manufacturer pulled out of the event altogether rather than risk supplying compounds that couldn't survive race conditions, leaving the other scrambling for a solution that never fully arrived in time. Drivers were, understandably, terrified. Richard Petty, as the head of the newly formed Professional Drivers Association, approached NASCAR founder Bill France Sr. and asked for the inaugural Talladega race to be postponed until the tire situation could be resolved. France, who had built his entire career on projecting unshakable confidence in his tracks and his sport, refused, and reportedly went so far as to drive laps around the speedway himself to prove it could be handled safely, though even he stayed well below the speeds the actual race cars were reaching in competition. He suggested drivers simply slow themselves down, a solution that ignored the basic reality of racing. If even one competitor pushed for full speed, everyone else would be forced to chase, tire failure or not. The standoff escalated quickly. Nearly every major star in the sport, Petty among them, along with other top names of the era, walked out rather than risk their lives on tires nobody trusted. France, characteristically stubborn, refused to cancel the event and instead prepared to run it with whatever field of cars and drivers remained willing to compete. It was, by any measure, one of the tensest moments in the sport's early history, a genuine standoff between the drivers who risked their lives on the track and a promoter unwilling to blink. Smokey Yunick's own black and gold Torino Talladega sat in the middle of that chaos, ready to race against a field that had just lost most of its biggest names overnight. Chrysler, seeing an opportunity in the confusion, pushed forward with the debut of its own radical aero car, the Dodge Charger Daytona, and convinced a handful of drivers willing to cross the picket line to compete anyway. When the race finally ran, it did so with a diminished, controversial field, and the result carried an asterisk that would follow it for years afterward. The inaugural Talladega 500 was won under conditions nobody considered a fair test of the cars involved, a hollow validation for a track and a car both built for something bigger. The real story of the Torino Talladega, though, didn't end with that chaotic opening weekend. Once the boycott passed and the sport's biggest names returned to competition, the car proved it was no fluke built for one controversial afternoon. David Pearson, driving a Talladega prepared by the Holman Moody race team, won 11 races that season and claimed the NASCAR Grand National Championship, praising the car for how predictable and controlled it felt through the corners at speeds that would have terrified drivers in almost anything else. Richard Petty, a lifelong Chrysler loyalist, made the surprising decision to switch to a Ford Talladega for part of the 1969 season and still finish second in the championship standings, a remarkable result for a car he hadn't even started the year driving. Between the Torino Talladega and its mechanically related Mercury cousin, the Cyclone Spoiler II, Ford's aero cars combined for roughly 29 Grand National wins across the 1969 and 1970 seasons, comfortably outperforming Chrysler's more visually dramatic winged cars and securing the manufacturer's championship for Ford. That dominance, though, came with a cost. NASCAR officials watched the aero wars escalate year after year and grew increasingly uneasy about where it was headed. These weren't recognizable street cars racing on Sunday afternoons anymore. They were purpose-built aerodynamic machines wearing just enough factory badging to qualify as production vehicles. By the end of 1970, NASCAR stepped in decisively, introducing a rule that restricted any car with the kind of radical aerodynamic modifications found on the Talladega, the Dodge Daytona, or the Plymouth Superbird to a much smaller 305 cubic inch engine, effectively erasing the performance advantage that had made these cars so dominant in the first place. Around the same time, growing political pressure in Washington, with congressional hearings pushing automakers to justify pouring money into racing rather than safety or fuel economy, added an entirely different kind of pressure on Detroit's factory-backed programs. Ford, facing that pressure alongside its own internal cost concerns, made the decision in late 1969 to withdraw factory support from motorsports altogether, across NASCAR, drag racing and endurance racing alike. Almost as quickly as the Aero War had begun, it was over, and the Torino Talladega, one of the most purpose-built machines Ford had ever created, was left without the sport it had been designed to conquer. Today the Ford Torino Talladega occupies a strange place in muscle car history. Roughly 750 production versions were built to satisfy NASCAR's homologation requirements, most sold to ordinary buyers who never came close to a superspeedway. For decades, collectors and enthusiasts gravitated instead toward Chrysler's Winged Warriors, the Charger Daytona and the Plymouth Superbird, whose towering rear wings and dramatic pointed noses made for far more dramatic photographs than the Talladega's smoother, more understated aggression. But the Talladega didn't need to shout for attention on the showroom floor. It did its talking on the track, quietly outperforming its flashier rivals where it actually mattered, and that quieter kind of dominance is finally being recognized by a new generation of historians and collectors who understand exactly what the car accomplished in period. Restored examples connected to the drivers and mechanics of that era, Pearson, Petty, and Yunick among them, now command real respect and real value among people who understand the full story behind the car. Smokey Yunick himself remained a fixture in American motorsports for decades after 1969, continuing to build engines, chase ideas other people considered impossible, and cultivate a reputation as the sport's most inventive rule-bender until his death in 2001. He never claimed sole credit for the Torino Talladega's design, and honest history shouldn't hand him that credit either. What he did bring to Ford's 1969 program was exactly what he'd brought to Chevrolet and Pontiac before it: relentless technical obsession, a willingness to push every regulation to its absolute limit, and a reputation fierce enough to make rival garages nervous before a single lap had been turned. So here's the question worth sitting with. What if the tire crisis at Talladega had never forced that boycott, and Yunick's Torino had gone wheel to wheel against Petty and the rest of NASCAR's biggest stars from the very first lap of that inaugural race? And what if NASCAR had never swung the hammer with its restrictor rule, and Ford had never pulled its factory support at the end of 1969? Could the Aero War have kept escalating, pushing cars like the Talladega even further past what anyone in 1969 thought was possible on a stock car oval? We'll never really know, and maybe that unanswered question is exactly why this car, and the outlaw mechanic connected to it, still get talked about more than half a century later.